Today, we'd like to talk about the thing that now you don't like, or you might even hate it, but which later you will like and maybe even love it. Please listen carefully. This thing which you probably don't like, or may not even know about, is the life which is above and beyond positive and negative. This is something natural. It's something that anyone can have, can use, can know, can practice, and can benefit from. So there's no need to waste any time thinking about whether I'm a Christian or whether I'm a Buddhist or whatever, because we're talking about something beyond such categories, something natural, available to all of us, something that doesn't depend on any one particular religion. In ordinary words, we just call this life. But it's a kind of life in which nothing can come in and condition, concoct, fabricate, or create what we call positive and negative. A life where nothing has the ability to stir up positive and negative. That means pleasantness and unpleasantness, liking, disliking, satisfaction and dissatisfaction. This is what we mean by life that is free of positive and negative. These things which disturb or which concoct and fabricate the positive and the negative are of both an external sort, meaning the sights, sounds, odors, tastes, touches, and mental objects which we experience. And then there are also some internal things which disturb and concoct. These internal things are nothing but the things we call the defilements, the impurities of mind. For those of you who believe in a religion which holds that there is a God, then you must understand that God wants you to be free of positive and negative, to have a life that isn't concocted and stirred up by positive and negative. Even the God, Yahweh, of Judaism, of the Old Testament in the Bible, even this God very clearly showed that he didn't want mankind to be trapped within good and evil, that is, within positive and negative. He very clearly forbid Adam and Eve to go and waste their time knowing about positive and negative, good and evil. All of us who believe in a God should understand that God doesn't want us to get caught up in and trapped by positive and negative. Although that's what God wants, we're not very interested. Most of us aren't interested in such a life, and we don't want it. So we're not very satisfied with this wish of God's. However, if we pay careful attention to this matter, we'll start to get interested and we'll begin to even desire such a life. And so we're going to use the time we have today to talk about this, so that in a short before long, you'll begin to appreciate the life that is beyond positive and negative. We'd like to do this relatively quickly so that you don't have to wait too long. If you wait too long, you might be dead before you ever learn about it. To understand this matter, we first have to know the difference between two things. The first thing is what we call the mind or the heart. The second thing is I, or me, or we can say egoistic consciousness. These two things are very different, and so we need to understand this difference before we go on. Our troubles begin when we experience life with I, when we have this feeling of I and me. When there's just the mind, when we just experience the mind, there's no problems. This experience of I, though, is where all our troubles begin. Because this is basically ignorant, foolish, and stupid. And from this ignorance, there arises craving, blind desires, and then a foolish clinging to things. And from this clinging and attachment, there arises I, the feeling or concept of I, that I am, I exist, which is an illusion. It has no real truth to it. It's just an illusion which is concocted by our attachment. This attachment stirs up this experience of I, which is the cause of all our problems. But when there's just mind, just experience of mind, this is something that is purely natural, and there's no problems with it. When somebody insults us or disparages us, yells at us, criticizes us, who does it bother? Who is touched by it? Or what is touched? Usually it's I. I am touched by this yelling and criticizing, and so I hurt. The mind isn't touched by it. We should see the difference here when we're criticized, yelled at, or whatever. That the thing that is touched by this is this feeling of I, and not the mind, the natural mind itself. When the mind is foolish, stupid, it considers itself to be I. The foolish mind takes itself to be I. And then when there's criticism or disparagement, the mind, this ignorant I, is touched, is disturbed, is hurt by it. But that pure natural mind, which has no ignorance, isn't touched at all. It's just this ignorant concept of I that is hassled and hurt. There's a very big difference here that we need to see between the ignorant illusion of I, which gets hurt and harmed, and the pure and natural mind, which isn't touched at all. But this is something very few people have come to see. We can't tell the difference between I and the mind. We take the mind to be I, or we take I to be the mind. We've muddled up the two, and so we've made our lives into a tremendous mess. Please look carefully and observe that the mind can be kept from suffering. It's quite easy for the mind, the pure natural mind, to avoid suffering, pain, and misery. But I, me, no matter what you do, I cannot avoid suffering. There's no way you can prevent me from being hurt, from being miserable. There's a tremendous difference between the two. There's really no difficulty in keeping the mind from experiencing suffering and misery. But it's inevitable that I will suffer and hurt. You should see this difference very closely in your own life. It's quite easy for the mind to be without suffering. It's very simple. But it's impossible for I to be free of misery, pain, or what we call dukkha. Suffering, pain, misery, dissatisfaction is a product of I. I is what causes our pain. I itself is an illusion, the product of ignorance, where the foolish mind has concocted this joke, this illusion, this trick of I, of me, of ego. And once this illusion arises, it causes pain, suffering. Having to carry around the burden of I, the burden of ego, this in itself is inevitably painful and miserable. Just having an I is in itself a drag. The ego is automatically painful. And so there's no way that I can be free of suffering. But the mind that is free of ignorance, attachment, and ego, it's naturally completely free of any pain, sorrow, and dissatisfaction. This is the difference. Let us stress once again that when we're insulted or yelled at, it's I that is touched, the ego, and not the mind itself. The mind is outside of, beyond the influence of any external activity like insults, being yelled at, being criticized, being abused. The mind is beyond this, outside of this. But I, ego, is under the influence of all these external factors and activities. And so I must suffer from the power of all those things. The mind itself is free of that influence. The mind is beyond being touched by those things, and so makes no problem of them. But I allows itself to be touched and conditioned by all those external things, and therefore it suffers. Please discriminate between the two cases. It will be of great value to you. When there is just mind, then there is no I. The mind that is pure and natural, free of ignorance and free of attachment, exists just as it is. But when ignorance leads to foolish clinging and grasping at things, then I is born. And when I am born, I drives out, chases away the mind. And then there is only I. Sometimes there is just mind. Other times there is just I. But it's always one or the other. There's no mixture or in-between state. Imagine that there's a kingdom of mentality, a mental kingdom. And then the natural pure mind is ruler of this kingdom. But then if I comes in, stages a revolution and takes over the throne, then I rules the kingdom of the mind, or the mental kingdom. And then there's no mind. There can only be one ruler, either mind or I. When I rules, it takes over all the functions and systems of the kingdom and warps it to the will of I, which is rooted in ignorance and blindness. And so everything happens according to I. And this leads to all kinds of problems. If there is I on the throne, then mind cannot be there. And when I is on the throne, it dominates all the workings of this kingdom. But when I is not there, then the natural mind can sit on the throne again. Things are always like this. Sometimes I disappears and there remains only the mind. But sometimes the mind is chased away and there remains only I, one or the other. And the difference is complete and absolute. It's the difference between black and white, something we need to look into. With this difference, this complete and utter difference between mind and I, we should learn how to separate the two. Learn how to remove the I, to take the I away from mind. When I comes in, then learn how to get rid of it. Or learn how to free mind from the I. Either way, learn to keep the two apart so that we don't let I take over the show. Whenever there is losing or winning, these are things that happen to I. The mind itself can neither lose nor win. This discriminating, judging, thinking of winning and losing is something that occurs only to the I, the ego, and the mind itself is untouched by that. All of these dualities, like winning and losing, are something that happens to I. These dualities, this winning and losing, are products of I, or of the deluded, ignorant mind. The pure mind doesn't deal with such things. They only arise out of ignorance. When you're going to, whether you're going to work or you're going to play sports or something, this is something that I does. It's not something done by the mind. I work, I play, I win, I lose. And all these various dualities of good and bad, positive and negative, they arise from I. They're products, they're the domain, the kingdom of I. The mind doesn't mess around with such things. The mind is beyond them. And so but when there is the foolish, ignorant mind, then it creates I and all the dualities of winning and losing. When ignorance, the ignorant mind, concocts I, then I work, I play, I win, I lose, and on and on and on. It's essential to discriminate between I and the mind itself. Please do so. There's something deep and secret which is able to turn the mind into I. This thing that can transform the mind into I is called upadana. In Thai, it's called upatan. In the language of the Buddha, it's called upadana. Upadana. We ask you to learn this word because once you understand its meaning, it will be very clear. It's often translated into English as attachment. But the translation attachment is nowhere near as good as the original upadana, because there's a lot of ambiguity to the English word attachment. So you're better off learning upadana, which is complete attachment, is the fullest or the deepest meaning of the word attachment. This upadana is what turns the mind into I. If we can understand this thing, upadana, then we'll be able to control things or to prevent the mind from being transformed by upadana into I, into me and mine. The mere or pure mind, the natural mind, exists in a way that is difficult to talk about. But when this mind is conditioned by ignorance, when ignorance, stupidity comes in, then there arises upadana. This is when the mind grabs onto something, attaches to something with ignorance. Upadana is grabbing onto, attaching foolishly, ignorantly. When the mind has grasped, attached to something ignorantly, then that mind, under this influence now of upadana, regards itself as I. So in this way, the upadana drives out the natural mind, and then there is just the foolishness of I. If we play sports just for the enjoyment of it, or play sports for the health, the exercise of it, then it's the pure mind which plays. But if we engage in sports in order to win or to lose, then it's I that plays. The pure mind just plays in a natural way, and it goes on very smoothly. But I plays in order to win, or I may lose. And this creates tremendous troubles for us. When we do things with I, the results are completely different from when the pure mind is what acts. If you can tell the difference between playing sports with mind and playing sports with I, then that will be quite a wonderful understanding, which will be of tremendous benefit to you. We should also have the same kind of understanding about work. Any work we do, we should find the difference between working with mind and working with I. If the mind is what's working, that means working with mindfulness and wisdom. Everything goes smoothly and peacefully. There's sufficient success. What needs to be done is accomplished properly, without the mind being hassled or getting into any problems. But if we engage in various businesses or the work of earning a living with I, then we make all kinds of troubles for ourselves. So work, earn a living, do whatever business you have to do without I. Learn to not let upadana come in and turn it into I work, I earn a living, and so on. Just do the work with mindfulness and wisdom, with a mind that is pure and natural. And then everything will go along easily, smoothly, and the mind will be at peace. Learn how to tell the difference between these two ways of doing things. And it'll be obvious to you which way is superior. If we work with the pure mind, the sweat comes out as holy water, which is cool. But if we work with I, with ego, with ego, then the sweat comes out as hot water, which torments us. So observe the difference between the work of mind, the work of the pure mind, and the work of I. Observe the difference between the two, and then learn how to work just with mind, to do the various duties and activities of work that belong just to mind. If we can do this, then we'll also learn the difference between the life of the pure mind and the life of I, of ego. And then we'll be able to live a life that is just a life of the mind, a mind that is pure, rather than a life that is trapped within I, ego, all the egoistic concepts and delusions that burden the ordinary life of people. And then we'll know the life of pure mind. And when we know the life of pure mind, there will be a life that's free of the influence of positive and negative. That will be a life which is cool, which never is scorched or burnt by any heat. It's a cool life which is free of dukkha, of suffering, misery, and pain. The pure mind is something that is original, that is natural and original. I, ego, the egoistic mind, is a new product, something that has been newly produced by ignorance. The original mind is cool and at peace, but this newly produced I is an illusion, a concoction arising from ignorance, from wrong understanding. And this makes life hot and painful. The life of the pure mind, of that original natural mind, is cool and free. But the life of I, of ego, of me and mind, is full of suffering. It's dominated by pain and sorrow and dissatisfaction. So understand that I and mind are completely different. Please understand this. That original natural mind lives in a state of just like that. It has a quality or state to it that is just like that, or just that way. But the ignorant I mind, the ignorant ego, has destroyed that natural original condition. So it's important to protect that original mind that is just like that. The original mind exists or goes along with causes and conditions, with circumstances. And and responds to them wisely. The natural original mind has knowledge which is able to prevent the arising of I, of ego. And so that original mind that has correct and proper knowledge can maintain that state of just like that, or just that way. But if there is foolishness, so it's very important that there be correct knowledge and understanding. Otherwise, the mind will just float. It'll just float around, drifting, going with the flow. And then it won't have the knowledge to protect it. And so various causes and conditions will concoct it. This is a tricky word to explain, but the various circumstances and situations will condition the mind, will program it, will cook it up, will stir it, will concoct it into I. When there's ignorance, that is a lack of this correct knowledge, then the mind gets cooked up and concocted into I. And then that natural original state of just like this is lost, is destroyed. So it's essential that we have this correct knowledge so that the mind doesn't just float in ignorance, but so that the mind can maintain its original natural state of just like that. It's necessary to make a very special study into this matter. It's important for you to make this special study in order to see that I, ego, is a new product that arises later, that it's not original. This is something that you can discover for yourself. If we consider the fetus in the womb, it's obvious that fetus has no thoughts or concepts of I. It's in no way thinking of I or ego. And then when the infant is newly born, it doesn't think of itself. It doesn't think of I, of me, of mine, because it can't think yet. It hasn't begun thinking yet. And so it hasn't produced the I. But then, as the senses of the infant begin to function, the eyes, the nervous system, including the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and the mind, both the physical and mental aspects of the senses begin to function. And then through this sense experience, the child begins to have certain experiences which are pleasant, which are agreeable, which it likes. And then other experiences which are unpleasant and disagreeable. For example, the child has its first taste of milk. It drinks mother's milk. And there arises the feeling of deliciousness. It tastes good. And then there later, or after that, there arises the feeling, I'm delicious. I'm delicious. This I arises afterward. It's stirred up by the pleasant, agreeable feeling, by the deliciousness of the milk. This I is a new product. Ego wasn't there from the beginning. It arose later because there wasn't the proper knowledge to understand things correctly. When the mind lacks proper understanding, then there arises this I, as we have described. This mind clings to things as positive and negative. When I arises, then positive and negative are born, and these create all kinds of dangers. These are very dangerous for I because they make it impossible for there to be peace. When there's the positive and the negative clinging to good and evil, there's no way that there can be any true and real peace. This clinging to I and to good and evil, clinging to positive and negative, is the root cause of what we call suffering. We'd like to point out that this is what in Christianity is called original sin. Original sin means merely regarding things as good and evil, as positive and negative. And once we regard them like that, then we create all kinds of problems out of that attachment. Through this regarding things as good and evil, then there arises all the problems that human beings experience. This is the meaning of original sin. The original natural mind is free of all that. It's beyond the influence of positive and negative. It doesn't know the positive and negative. But then I arises later and causes all these difficulties. So it's very important to discriminate between the natural mind and ego. When God first created Adam and Eve, they hadn't yet tasted of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they had no I, no ego. But after they had gone and eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, then I arose. And from this I, they were clinging to things as good and bad, as positive and negative. And they suffered for this. They had to endure great pain because of this. Originally, there was no ignorance, but through eating this fruit, there arose ignorance, and then suffering followed. This is the same as with the newborn infant. The newborn infant hasn't yet discriminated anything as good or evil, positive or negative, and so it doesn't suffer. But then as time goes on, the child begins to know good and know evil. And from this discrimination, ego is created. And then the child suffers. This is how original sin occurs in the life of all human beings. Through this discrimination of things being good, being evil, being negative, being positive, there arises all kinds of misery. And we go and attach to the good, the positive, way too much. And it makes us crazy, at least neurotic, and sometimes even psychotic, because of this attachment. So would you please interpret this passage from the Christian Bible from Genesis, chapters 2 and 3, which we've been talking about. Interpret it in this way, and then you'll have a very valuable understanding. That when originally Adam and Eve were free of ego and therefore free of suffering, but by eating that fruit, coming to know good and evil, discriminating things as good and evil, attaching to things as good and evil, there arose I. This is where the concept of I first arose, through this discriminating and attaching. And the result of that is the pain and suffering that we're still enduring today. This is how you should understand the words original sin. You should also know that we all have a certain great fortune, a good fortune, that we have not yet received. There is a good fortune that we haven't received yet. In the Bible, in the final book, the book of Revelations, it speaks of another tree, the tree of life, or the tree of eternal life. That first tree, the tree of good and evil, is crazy. All it does is lead to suffering, that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But if we eat the fruit of the tree of life, it does away with original sin and all those problems. But we haven't received this fruit yet. God has surrounded it with all kinds of weapons and all kinds of soldiers to prevent us from reaching the tree of life, the tree of eternal life. But now the time has come for those of us who have been suffering the consequences of original sin up until this very day. Isn't it now time for us to look for, to go in search of this tree of life, the tree of life that will free us from all the lunacy, the idiocy of our attachments to good and evil, to positive and negative. The opportunity is now arisen for you to receive that great fortune. You now have the opportunity to eat the fruit of the second tree. This opportunity is called the mindfulness with breathing cultivation of mind, anapanasati bhavana, the mindfulness with breathing cultivation of mind. This is a way for those of us who are still under the influence of eating that first fruit, the fruit that leads to attachment to good and evil. This is a way for us to recover the natural original mind. Recover it in a way that our understanding is complete and correct, so that we can eliminate all the influence of eating that original fruit by that first fruit, by eating this second fruit. We now have this opportunity within the practice of mindfulness with breathing. This isn't something you have to wait for any longer. The time has now come. It's just a matter of whether you want it or not. If you want it, you now have the chance. When the mind is under the influence of the first tree, then it won't be at all interested in this thing we're talking about. But when the mind has eaten the fruit of the second tree, then it will be most interested. It will even love this thing we're talking about. This is why at the beginning we talk about the thing that now you're not interested in, that you don't like, but that someday you may learn to love. Now, you don't really like this thing, but in the future, you may learn to love it. If you come to eat the second fruit, then you'll really want and need what we've been talking about. Many, many dozens of years ago, there was a song which maybe anybody out there who's up in years a bit might remember this one. This song goes something, there's one line in this song that says, "It is one day your lips will say, I love you." And if you one day come to taste the fruit of the second tree, then you'll sincerely want to be liberated from, to be completely freed of all that original sin. And then you'll truly love this thing we've been talking about. So this is what we've set out to discuss today, and we've now come to the end of our time, and today's talk is now finished.
ขอให้ร้องเพลงบรรทัดนี้ไว้เรื่อยๆมันจะชอบกันสักวันหนึ่ง ร้องเพลงบรรทัดนี้ไว้เรื่อยๆ
If you sing this line over and over again, one day you'll love it.
ชีวิตเหนือบวกเหนือลบ
You'll love the life that is above positive and above negative.
วันนี้ไม่ชอบวันหน้าจะชอบ
Today you don't like it yet, but one of these days you'll like it. He heard this song before he ordained, which means over 60 years ago. Today we'll discuss the benefits of a thing called Attamayata. This thing is strange to your ears. You don't know yet what it is. So please listen carefully and pay good attention so that you will learn what this thing is about. When we know this thing, laughter and crying won't be able to affect us. Laughter is something that we can do if it's necessary, but generally it's just a kind of lunacy. Crying is something we could do if we need to, but usually it's just a play or a show. These things need not disturb or touch the mind. They, in themselves, have their own conditions, their own causes. If we understand their causes, these actions, these activities can be produced. But still, they need not concern the mind itself. So we should understand the causes of these actions. Both laughter and crying are actions that depend on their own particular causes. The same is true with happiness and suffering. Happiness and suffering arise due to certain conditions, and without those conditions, they don't occur. So we can't just make ourselves laugh or cry, be happy, or suffer by forcing ourselves. Instead, we have to bring about the proper conditions for these things. And therefore, it's necessary to understand the causes and conditions of such things. For the common person, in certain situations, they can't help but laugh. They just laugh without being able to control themselves. And in other situations, they can't help but cry. The crying just happens without their ability to control. The ordinary person laughs and cries without any self-restraint. This is because they aren't able to endure the conditions which lead to laughter and crying. So when these conditions come about, they react without controlling themselves. But if we can restrain ourselves so that in laughable situations we refrain from laughing, and in crying situations we refrain from crying, if we can endure these conditions, if we can live through these conditions with this kind of restraint, and you understand what we mean here, then you'll know the meaning of the word Attamayata, or you'll understand the benefit of Attamayata. For the common person, when a certain kind of sense object comes by, they automatically laugh. And when another kind of object comes by, they automatically cry. These conditions automatically stir up, or naturally for them, stir up crying and laughter. And there's nothing we can do to help such people. But if we understand these causes and conditions of laughter and crying, and if we're able to control the mind so it doesn't blindly react to these conditions, so that it isn't affected by these conditions, then the mind won't have to suffer through these conditions. This mind won't need to laugh or cry. Instead, it will be cool, calm, and clear. This is a benefit that comes from this is the kind of knowledge we need to have. We need to have this kind of knowledge and then learn how to use it. If we have this correct sort of knowledge, then we'll be able to live through life without being affected or confused or disturbed by all these various conditions. To understand what we're talking about, you need to know the Pali word pajjaya, or in Thai pajjai. We can usually translate it as condition. Pajjaya means a condition or a factor that leads to, that causes the occurrence of another thing. A pajjaya is one thing which causes the occurrence or the arising of another thing. There are two basic kinds of pajjaya. One is the external kinds, the pajjaya that are associated with the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body sense. And then there's the internal kind of pajjaya. The external kind of conditions can concoct the mind. They can stir up the mind, cook up the mind. And with the internal conditions, such as craving, attachment, conceit, egoism, selfishness, and ignorance and defilement, these internal conditions go along with those external conditions to cook up the mind, concoct the mind, stir up the mind. If we're able to control these pajjaya, or actually to control the mind so that the pajjaya aren't able to stir it up and concoct it, then this, in knowing how to do that, we will know what Attamayata is. This no longer being cooked up and stirred up by conditions, external and internal. This is the meaning of Attamayata. So the meaning of the word Attamayata is the kind of knowledge where the mind won't be concocted by any more pajjaya ever again. Attamayata is the knowledge that to not be concocted, not be conditioned, not be cooked up by that pajjaya, that condition, ever again. When the mind has this knowledge that will protect it in this way, then the mind knows Attamayata. Think about this, what kind of benefits there are in this knowledge of Attamayata. The ordinary life of just about everyone, even if we've studied at university, is a life that has no knowledge, no understanding of Attamayata. And so these ordinary common lives that don't know about Attamayata are always ready, are always able to be stirred up, to be concocted by any condition that comes by. This is the result of not understanding Attamayata. Even more weird than this is that not only does modern education lack the knowledge of Attamayata, in fact, because of modern education, there's more concocting, conditioning, and cooking up of the mind than ever before. Not only is Attamayata lacked, but its opposite is increasing. And for this reason, because there's no Attamayata, and more and more of its opposite. There is much more suffering and pain in people's lives. Minds are always being concocted in all kinds of strange and fascinating ways. And so if this continues, there's no way that people will be able to find peace through modern education. So now what we'd like to do is consider and discriminate between various kinds of concocting and then the various results of these different kinds of concocting. We don't think that this will be at all a waste of time to consider these various items. For example, love. What kind of complications and troubles does it stir up for the mind? And then all the different kinds of anger. What are the myriad problems and troubles that this creates for the mind? Hatred in its various forms. How much trouble and pain does it cause for the mind? And then fear. Whether the really stupid fear that has no reason, or even the ordinary fear. What sort of problems and difficulties does this do to the mind? And then excitement, which is really funny how much people are interested in getting excited. They like to go watch sports and football and all kinds of things just to get excited. How much difficulty and trouble does excitement make for the mind? And then worries about things that haven't come yet. How much does this disturb the mind? And then longing for things, reminiscing about things that have passed away. Laying sleepless at night, crying about the things that we have lost. What kind of pain and suffering does this bring to the mind? And then what about envy? All the problems that are created because so many people are envious of others. All the trouble and strife and conflict that's caused by envy. What kind of hassles does this bring? And then ordinary possessiveness and worrying about things that we possess. And then that particular kind of jealous possessiveness like married people feel towards their spouses. What kind of trouble and conflict does this cause in the heart? And if we think back over all these examples that we've just listed, and all the troubles that each of them cause, all the disturbances and hassles they make for the heart and mind, if we were free of all of these things and their effects, then what kind of peacefulness, how much calmness and tranquility would there be in the heart? The thing that in various religions is called salvation, in Buddhism, the meaning of this word salvation is very simple. It means to be free from, to be saved from the torment of all these things that we have just mentioned. The kind of knowledge and cleverness that we gain through modern education isn't able to control or restrain these various things which trouble the mind. Not only that, modern education often makes us clever and skillful in ways that increase the damage that is done by these various things. We learn very clever ways of thinking, and then we think on and on and on, which stir up all these various concoctions of the mind. And so instead of living with just a bit of suffering, we live with a lot of suffering because we're so clever, we're so highly educated. And what about being wealthy, being rich, being successful in our work in accumulating wealth, so that now most of us are relatively rich, especially compared to the past. And all these riches, what good do they do us? Do they help us to control all these harmful concoctions, do they help us to get free of suffering? It's impossible that all our wealth, that our riches will be able to save us from the pain and misery we inflict on ourselves with these various concoctions and their effects. You might think that if we're rich, then we can buy whatever we want. But where are you going to buy the means to quench dukkha? Where are you going to buy the knowledge that will allow you to free yourself from dukkha? In fact, all this wealth just creates more and more craving, more thirst and more hunger, which creates more and more dukkha in its wake. And all this wealth doesn't give us the means to free ourselves from that suffering. It just creates and increases it. So to pin our hopes on wealth and on riches is a very foolish proposition. And then what about this thing called civilization, which for the world nowadays means merely material progress, material development. This so-called civilization, which is only concerned with increasing material pacaya, where can you find that it really helps to eliminate suffering? All this material progress, where can you find it actually ending suffering? If you actually look at it honestly, which should be very easy for all of you since you come from Europe and America and the so-called civilized countries, it should be very easy for you to see if it's actually eliminating or quenching any suffering, or if in fact it's merely causing more and more problems, more and more misery, more and more pain within our hearts and minds. This emphasis, this blind attachment to material progress, and at the same time ignoring the mind and the heart. Take a good look at it and see if you can actually find it doing anything besides causing more problems, more trouble for our minds. Back in the days when there wasn't all this civilization and progress, people used to kill each other quite a bit. Nowadays that we've got civilization, people are killing themselves quite a bit. You ought to think about this one. Back when there wasn't much civilization, there weren't many problems. There were problems, but people could find a way out, could find a way of dealing with the problems. But now that we're civilized, we've got so many problems, so many difficulties, and so much suffering that we can't find the way to cope with it all. And so when we can't cope with it, the escape we choose is to kill ourselves. Just to be rich and have a lot of material possessions doesn't help us solve the problem. It just causes more hunger, more thirst, and increases our misery. And so we just kill ourselves. That's the only way that people find to deal with the situation. This is the gift of all this civilization and progress. The gift of this civilization is suicide. These people who commit suicide are spiritually crazy. They're spiritual lunatics. They kill themselves because they've got too much love, too much hate, too much lust, too much anger, too much fear, too much excitement, too much envy, too much jealousy, too much worry. They've got way too much of all these things. And so they're spiritually crazy. And they're so crazy that they get their satisfaction out of killing themselves. This cleverness and the smarts that we honor so much nowadays, this is something that ends up getting crazier and crazier. This cleverness that's so important to people nowadays, this cleverness that they teach us in the schools and universities, is the kind that ends up crazy. It doesn't really have an outlet. It doesn't really lead anywhere. and then once it reaches its dead end or gets backed into a corner, then it just goes crazy, and the result is often suicide. Or even if the so-called intelligence of modern man, it's really the same thing, and just ends up being a bunch of lunacy, because it's unable to help us with the important things. This may sound strange to you, that intelligence can be wrong. This is something that people haven't even thought of, which is quite a sad thing. People haven't realized that there can both be correct intelligence and wrong intelligence. There can be wise intelligence and crazy, insane intelligence. We can use all this knowledge and learning and intellectual ability that is developed both in a useful, productive way, or we can use it in harmful, selfish ways. So you see very intelligent people who use their knowledge and intelligence to commit all kinds of crimes, to oppress other people, and do all kinds of disgusting things. Or intelligence can also be used to realize enlightenment, to become a perfected human being. Intelligence can go either way, correctly or ignorantly. So we should learn what kind of intelligence is correct and be particularly interested in that kind, and forget about all this intelligence which just makes us crazy, which just increases and multiplies all the various bhajaya, the various conditions which bring us suffering. Even the thing called religion is something that can go either way. Not very long ago, there were stories in the newspapers about a group, the Temple Church or something, where because of their beliefs and various conditions, they went and killed each other. Hundreds of them drank cyanide Kool-Aid and committed suicide. This is what happens with so-called intelligence. Even in the form of religion, this intelligence can go astray, can get further and further engrossed in things which just make us crazier and crazier. So even with the thing called religion, we need to be very careful to make sure it's a kind of intelligence that is of real benefit. Attamayata can help us to help us to avoid this kind of intelligence which just makes us crazy. Let's go back to talk about civilization again. This civilization that we've got, it doesn't stop producing the conditions for suffering. It hasn't ended this proliferation of the causes of misery. Instead, it just creates more and more of them, manufacturing and producing more and more causes and conditions and bhajaya for pain, misery, and dukkha. So obviously we can't rely on this civilization. It's not going to help us to stop the conditions for dukkha, because it just creates more and more of them. So there's no way that we can depend on civilization. No matter if we get to the pinnacle, the highest level of civilization, no matter how high we go, we won't be able to enter the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God can't be reached by someone who is living on the highest levels of civilization. And the higher and higher it gets, the more impossible it is to realize the kingdom of God. Those of you who follow a religion that believes in a creator God of some sort, this civilization or this material progress that we have nowadays, there's no way that this civilization can bring us to a true experience of God. There's no way that we can realize the kingdom of God through all this material progress. And this is even more true for those religions that don't have such a thing as a creator God. For the evolutionist religions, rather than theistic religions, the evolutionist religions like Buddhism, it's even more clear that this civilization, this material progress, won't help us to realize the supreme reward in life, the supreme goal. Instead, all this material progress just takes us further and further away from the purpose and meanings of our lives. So, when it comes to religious matters or spiritual matters, this civilization is just about worthless. In fact, it gets in our way more than anything else. You ought to know that the highest kind of person in Buddhism, the highest level of a person can reach in Buddhism is that of the Arahant, the worthy one, or the perfected human being. The Arahant is a being whose mind cannot be touched or concocted by any conditions. It's above all these various concoctions and conditions that we've talked about. And so it remains unconcocted, unconditioned by all these things. This is the highest perfection of the human heart. The highest kind of person, or the highest kind of individual, is the Arahant. And the highest Dhamma, the highest level of nature, is Nibbana. Nibbana is the condition or state of the mind, or which the mind knows or realizes when nothing is concocting or conditioning the mind. When nothing is cooking up and stirring up, concocting the mind, that mind is cool. It's absolutely peaceful, calm, quiet, still. It has no problems, no troubles. Nothing disturbs it or darkens it. This is the mind that is absolutely free from dukkha. This state where there is no concocting of the mind, no conditioning of the mind, this is the highest thing, the thing that we call Nibbana. The ordinary common fixture, the ordinary human being, is one whose mind is constantly being cooked up and stirred up by various causes and conditions. The ordinary fixture's mind is full of all this concocting. A slightly and then a somewhat better level of humanity are those where the attachment to things is significantly lessened. And so there's only a little of this concocting remaining, where the mind is only somewhat stirred up by causes and conditions. And then the highest level of humanity, or perfected humanity, is that of Arahant, where nothing is stirring up the mind, nothing concocts the mind. The mind is completely above all these causes and conditions which create so much havoc in the mind of the ordinary fixture, who we see running around all over the place. As for these common fixtures, the woman in the street, the man in the road, most of them, their minds are just about full of craziness. You can take a look for yourselves and see to what extent their lives are just full of craziness, running here, running there, constantly running back and forth. Their minds being stimulated by all kinds of things, always running, never able to stop and relax and take a true rest. They only rest when they're too exhausted to keep running. These are the ordinary fixtures whose minds are constantly being stimulated by all kinds of strange and wonderful conditions which we proliferate in this world. And so their minds are always cooking up all these kinds of different things. And so they get lost in all these conditions and concoctions of their minds. When this is the situation, if you look, you wonder how much humanity is really there. The word human being in Pali is manussaya, which literally means lofty-minded or high-minded. To have a mind, a heart that's above all these troubles, problems, and conditions. And if we see these people running around trapped within these conditions, then you have to wonder how much humanity is really there in these ordinary, stimulated lives. But then, if we can understand this point and begin to get free of all this concocting of the mind, then it's possible to go up a level, or up a few levels, or many levels, and become more and more human, to increase our humanness by more and more having a mind that is free of all these conditions, which keeps the ordinary person constantly running. Now let's look at how this is all related to the practice of anapanasati. If you are successful in your practice of the first stage of anapanasati, that is the first 4 steps, which are concerned with the body, where you study the breathing, the kinds of breathing, their effects on the body, and then learn to calm that breathing and calm the body thereby. In being successful at this, then we will develop quite a bit of mental power and a very high efficiency in our ability to raise the mind above all these, over the power of all these conditions, to concoct it. If we're successful in practicing just this first stage of mindfulness with breathing, the mind has quite a bit of ability and strength in which to climb out of all this conditioning and concocting. If we're successful in the second stage of anapanasati, that is the 4 steps concerned with the vedana, the feelings, then we'll be able to control all feelings so that they can no longer concoct the mind. These feelings are very important because normally when the mind makes contact with ordinary conditions, then it reacts to these with feelings, sometimes positive feelings, sometimes negative feelings, and other times in between or uncertain feelings. And because of the powers of these feelings, sometimes the mind becomes stupid in a positive way, and other times it's a negative kind of stupidity. But whatever these feelings are, always pulling the mind off into foolishness and into craving, attachment, and suffering. These feelings allow conditions to concoct the mind in very powerful ways. And if we don't understand this, then we'll always be a slave to these feelings and the conditions which lead to them. So this points to the importance of understanding the feelings and getting them under control, which is what we'll be able to do if we're successful in practicing the second stage of anapanasati. If we consider this in the most detailed way, on the most profound, the deepest, the most subtle level, then we will see that every problem that exists in this human world has the vedana, the feelings, as their cause. All the problems that we human beings experience have vedana at their root. This is because human beings have no ability to control these feelings, and so allow them to concoct the mind in all kinds of different ways, leading to all kinds of greed, anger, delusion, all kinds of selfishness and suffering. If we understand this point, if we look very carefully, then we'll see the imperative to understand the vedana and be able to control them so they can no longer concoct the mind. If all of humanity were able to do so, if all human beings could control the vedana, then all our problems would cease. Remember that when we use this word feelings, we don't mean the emotions. We're talking about the much more subtle mental activity that in Pali is known as vedana. And these these feelings, we ask that you remember, we beg, we plead that you remember this one sentence about the Vedana. If you can control the Vedana, you can control the whole universe. If you can control the Vedana, these feelings, you can control the entire universe. It's a short sentence. You ought to be able to remember it. Then one more sentence, but first let us assure you that we're not trying to tease you about your own religion or make fun of your God or whatever. But if we can control the Vedana, then we will be out from under the control of God. If we can control the Vedana, then we will be free of the control of God. We're not trying to make fun of anything, but this is a fact which you ought to know. Let's stress it. We're not trying to insult or make fun of or belittle or any God or any religion that believes in a God or any person who has such beliefs. We're not making fun of anything, but this is a truth, a fact that we feel it's our duty to inform you. We're not making fun of anyone's beliefs. We're just trying to state the facts. Now we're all slaves to these feelings, these Vedana. We do all kinds of things in order to get the Vedana we like, that we want, and we do a whole bunch of other things trying to get rid of and avoid the Vedana that we don't like, that are unpleasant for us. Because the Vedana have the power to make us do so many different things, the fact that so much that our life is just a bunch of running after certain Vedana and running away from other Vedana, this shows very clearly that our lives are just slavery to these Vedana. The meaning of slavery here is that these feelings are able to concoct the mind. They have this power to concoct the mind, and we're unable to control it. This is the importance of raising the mind above the power of these feelings to concoct it anymore. The next is the third stage, or tetrad, of mindfulness with breathing, which in Pali is known as cittanupassana, the contemplation of the mind, of the heart. In practicing this stage of anapanasati, the mind is able to, we're able to have the mind completely under control, so that the mind is no longer concocted in any way. Having the mind under control means that it is always in a state that is proper, is correct, where nothing is stirring it up or conditioning it in any way. This is the benefit of practicing the third stage of anapanasati successfully. When we can do this, then the mind is pure, it's spotless, it's free of the power of anything to condition it. Anything positive or negative that comes by can be refused, can be negated, can be by this mind. Although this mind still lives, this is still a living mind, it is completely free of the power of all these things, of all these many positive and negative conditions to concoct it. This is the mind that is liberated. Through success in practicing the third stage of anapanasati, this very excellent thing can be achieved, this liberation of the mind. And then the fourth stage of anapanasati is called dhammanupassana, the contemplation of Dhamma. Here Dhamma means all things. All things includes both the ordinary positive and negative things, and then also that which transcends the positive and the negative. This is the Dhamma which is contemplated and then understood in this fourth stage. When this is understood, when all things, when all conditioned and unconditioned things are understood, then we know that there's nothing anywhere or ever could be anything which we can attach to and cling to as I or mine. There's absolutely nothing that can be regarded as I or mine, as me or myself. And with this understanding regarding everything, when the mind is absolutely clear on this point, then Attamayata is complete and perfect. This knowledge of Attamayata will be perfected through this fourth stage of Anapanasati. This is the specialness or the excellence of this stage of our practice. So in summary, all four stages of Anapanasati are a tool for us to realize the completion, the perfection of Attamayata. These four stages of mindfulness with breathing practice will allow our mental life and our spiritual life to be completely free of the power of anything to concoct it. The knowledge of Attamayata to not be concocted by any condition ever again. This non-concoctability of the mind can be realized using Anapanasati as a tool. So this is the benefit of Attamayata, non-concoctability. And on this note, we ask that we end today's lecture.